Hey guys. I planned on making this video and releasing it amidst the chaos of Seattle riots on Monday, but nothing really happened here. I think it is literally because everyone decided to share Pepsi and joints. Or perhaps it has something to do with Seattle police force seriously having their shit together downtown. I mentioned in a previous video that I learned very little about communism in public school. I've done a few videos in a quick historical rundown format that people seem to really like 101 style, so I thought I would do the same on the subject of communism, because I am consistently struck by how little people know about it. And it seems fairly obvious to me that your average Antifa member is not fully aware of the atrocities and genocide that are always the outcome of communism. I simply cannot believe that these basement-dwelling, pansexual 20-year-olds aren't just ideological and ignorant. In the middle of the 19th century, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, and they believed in materialism, basically that nothing exists apart from matter. They incorporated dialectics into their philosophies, claiming that conflict is the basic law of nature and of humanity. And eventually, they developed the theory of dialectical materialism, which centered on the premise that all developments in the universe come through conflict. At the beginning of the 20th century, revolutionary ideas were spreading amongst workers and permeated a large minority of the military. The populace was displeased by the relatively few changes made by the Tsar, Nicholas II, after the revolution of 1905, so Russia became a hotbed of radical socialism. The dominant socialist party, the Russian Social Democratic Party, subscribed to Marxist ideology, and the leader of that movement was Vladimir Lenin. The Bolsheviks, which means majority, believed that bloody revolution was not only necessary, but was completely inevitable. And they seized the opportunity in 1914 with the outbreak of the First World War, which we all know was extremely bloody. They faced defeat over and over, and the suffering inflicted by the war dragged Soviet Russia toward revolution. The losses Russia suffered in the World War were catastrophic. Between 900,000 and 2.5 million Russians were killed, and around 5 million were wounded. Nearly 4 million Russian soldiers were held as POWs. Britain, France, and Germany had 1.3 million POWs combined. Economically, Russia was devastated. 8 million rubles in war debts were outstanding. Inflation soared. The gold reserves, which backed the currency, were nearly empty. Russia was on the verge of complete collapse. World War I was between 1914 and 1918, and in 1917, army revolutionaries took over Russia. Tsar Nicholas II was stopped by revolutionaries and was arrested. Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, and their children, as well as their doctor and 3 of their servants, who had voluntarily chosen to remain with the family, were all executed by Bolshevik firing squad. The government was passed into the hands of Kerensky, who was more liberal and pro-West. Lenin had been exiled in 1907 by the Tsar, but was still able to give orders to his men to denounce the government while he continued to organize the Bolsheviks for his own revolution. Lenin's militants attacked the center of the government and carried out an exceptionally easy coup. And on November 7th, the Bolshevik-led Red Guards deposed the provincial government and proclaimed Soviet rule. Most of the population of Russia before 1914 lived in villages with a very low standard of living, but could still feed themselves and their families. Lenin decided in 1918 that private property was forbidden and peasants' goods would be confiscated by the state. Bolshevik officers rounded up peasants, crops, and resources by gunpoint, and all had to give up basically everything that they possessed to the government. One inspector wrote, quote, "Abuses of position by the requisitioning detachments, frankly speaking, have now reached unbelievable levels. Systematically, the peasants who are arrested are all locked up in big unheated barns. They are then whipped and threatened with execution. Those who have not filled the whole of their quota are bound and forced to run naked all along the main street of the village and then locked up in another unheated hangar. A great number of women have been beaten until they are unconscious and then thrown naked into holes dug in the snow." In 1921 and 1922 alone, 5 million people starved to death. Most communists would argue that this was inadvertent resource misallocation, but that's not true. Lenin created this famine by design and thought it would destroy people's religious beliefs and make them cower to communism. The Black Book of Communism describes Lenin's state of mind. Famine, he explained, in destroying the outdated peasant economy, would bring about the next stage more rapidly and usher in socialism, the stage that necessarily followed capitalism. Famine would also destroy faith, not only in the Tsar, but in God too. Lenin was able to be so ruthless because dialectical materialism lended to his ruthlessness. The philosophy regards humans as just animals. The material world is the only world and embraces violence and conflict as the natural state of existence. Not to mention that these were populations of people that were literally being trained like animals. I am not kidding. Lenin paid personal visits to Russian scientist Pavlov, who conducted the well-known response experiments in dogs, to learn how to standardize the population of Russia. After a long and brutal reign, Lenin died after having a stroke and going mad. Stalin, who was arguably more ruthless, succeeded him and ruled for 30 years. He spent his first years in power consolidating his position and had Trotsky, who was the leader of the Red Army, arrested and exiled, because he viewed him as a threat to his position of power. And in 1929, he implemented collectivization. Lenin's experiment of collectivizing the land was a half-finished project at best, and peasants were still selling produce at the market. Stalin was determined to complete Lenin's initiative and to take all the land in the name of the state. In 1930, peasant produce was collected from every single field. Agricultural equipment was also seized, so even if they hid their goods, which some did, they could not produce the crops. The famine this time, as expected, was much worse. 6 million starved in Ukraine, 2 million in Kazakhstan, and 1 million in northern Caucasus. Peasants ate corpses, and they even kidnapped children and ate them. Stalin had succeeded. Everyone that opposed him was detained and executed or were sent to die in labor camps. Like Lenin, this ruthlessness really delighted Stalin, especially the famine. He declared collectivization a raving success and was applauded by all of the delegates. Some 300 voted against him in a secret vote, but Stalin had the ballots burned and all that voted against him, and 700 additional, executed. Of course, he declared proudly that he unanimously had been voted in. In 1941, the Nazis forced the Soviet Union into the bloodiest war in history. 25 million Soviet citizens lost their lives between 1941 and 1945. Yet still, Stalin killed more. Just between 1937 and 1938 alone, 7 million were detained for political offenses and 1 million were executed. Eventually, the death toll under Stalin reached nearly 42 million, although we're not completely sure. And additionally, he had forced millions out of their homelands to be shipped to Siberia. Stalin died in 1953, but the Red Terror continued. They put down the Hungarian opposition and the Czech opposition later in 1968, and bodies just lined the street. They also invaded Afghanistan in 1979. I know I only discussed Russia and didn't get in too much to the worldwide spread of communism, but that is due to the astronomical death toll during this period in the region and due to the direct Marxist influence. But at one point, nearly 1/3 of the world was under communist reign. And let us not forget that there has never been a successful communist country, and that communism lends to genocide and poverty in every country where it is practiced. Stalin regarded Mao as a personal friend, and in 1950, communist North Korea attacked South Korea. UN forces were sent in to balance the situation and lasted for 3 years and cost 3 million lives. The Red Chinese Army entered the war on the side of North Korea while Soviets provided arms and equipment, and simultaneously, Mao became more involved with internal Chinese affairs. He confiscated private property, hundreds of thousands were tried and executed for minor crimes. But the greatest loss of life began with the Great Leap Forward. People starved because they thought there was a surplus of crops from misreporting. To meet quotas, some people would replant already harvested crops. So Mao moved laborers to construction sites, believing that there was an agricultural surplus and the labor would be better suited elsewhere. There was, of course, a huge production gap, and the fields were left empty while worthless steel was made for no reason. In 1960, the worst famine in the history of mankind began, which coincided with a terrible drought. 40 million people starved to death in just 2 years. Mao went into seclusion and thought that the failure of the Great Leap was due to communism not being spread far enough, and he reemerged in the second half of the 1960s. And of course, I didn't even mention Cambodia, around 2 million deaths in a population of 7 million or so, or Vietnam, or the number of socialist regimes that have committed crimes against humanity, Cuba and Venezuela, just to name a few. Communism was the leading ideological cause of death between 1900 and 2000. The 94 million that perished in China, the Soviet Union, North Korea, Afghanistan, Eastern Europe, easily trumped the 28 million that died under fascist regimes during the same period. During the century, more people died as a result of communism than the combined total from homicide, which was 58 million, and genocide, 30 million. Additionally, all of the world's worst famines during the 20th century were communist countries, China twice, the Soviet Union, and North Korea. Yet despite its brutality, we see communism and socialism permeating all aspects of our society. This, of course, is by design, and I give a breakdown on how communists were determined to permeate our institutions in my video about cultural Marxism, which I've linked below. I live amongst tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people that are outright unapologetic socialists and communists. There's a statue of mass murdering Lenin in Fremont that every Christmas is adorned with a glowing red star. We also have a literal socialist who is a member of Socialist Alternative, a political party that defines itself as Trotskyite, on the Seattle City Council. His decisions and influence were actually responsible for the deaths of millions. Kshama Sawant has adopted the typical canon of Marxist philosophy: collectivism, as well as the labor theory of value, which is the idiotic theory that labor creates value and not demand. We know this because she wants a minimum wage, and a large part of her platform is advocating for ridiculously cushy workers' rights and against corporate interests. She also believes in dialectical materialism, which, as you remember, is the Marxist theory of reality that change in nature is the product of inherent internal conflict. So it is no surprise that with a worldview based on inherent struggle of an underclass, Kshama Sawant called for protests in Seattle in response to Trump's election.
I appeal to you, today at 4 o'clock, 4 p.m. Westlake, let's have a massive protest and tell America we do not accept a racist agenda. And let's make sure that on inauguration days, on the 20th and 21st of January, let's do a nationwide shutdown and occupy inauguration.
Like I said before, I simply do not believe that most current socialists and communists are aware of the horrors that these philosophies have resulted in. Collectivism, communism, Marxism, socialism, they are appealing to people that cannot cut it in the free market. If you are smart and capable, you can learn a trade or learn how to read people and communicate with them. And then you can turn your abilities into a marketable skill and ultimately into money and resources. If you cannot do this because you're too incompetent or too stupid or too lazy, or in the case of most feminists, just too ugly, your only real chance for attaining resources easily is to suck off the teat of more worthwhile people. This is why we see university students and Antifa who have no real skills or resources actively advocating for a system that would redistribute wealth to them, irrespective of their negative contribution to society. This is why they are religiously devoted to Marxist principles. Their survival, their reproduction, their sustainability, and their very identity are all dependent on Marxism and contingent on not only its representation, but its continuation. So they will absolutely fight for this principle. And the most common argument that I hear is that authoritarians seize power, bastardizing the fundamental nature of communism. This is not true. Lenin, Stalin, Mao, they practice communist principles perfectly through their complete disregard for human life and through their myopic focus on production and collectivism. This is the nature of communism. They seize the means of production, make the population poor, and suppress them while some murderous cronies live the high life. It happens every single time. It will never work. And it will never work because it eliminates meritocracy, individualism, and it cages the human spirit. And it is not just the philosophical revolutionaries and the leaders at the top that are dangerous. Antifa, Kshama Sawant, academia, and the millions of sheeple who need government resources to survive and procreate. These are dangerous people. Communism is the antithesis of beauty, life, and freedom. It nearly took over the world, and although it seemed to be defeated, it lives on in our institutions and is perpetuated by our own society. So to those of us trying to protect not only our most basic and fundamental rights, but our lives, communism is our greatest enemy. Thank you for watching. Sorry that I had kind of a weak month last month as far as number of videos were concerned. I was visiting family and doing some other traveling, but it looks like I will be able to get a bunch of work done this month. So stay tuned for hopefully twice weekly videos. Thanks again, and I'll see you soon. Bye.